What is up everybody, Dusty here. Now if you're familiar with my channel, you probably know that I'm a big fan of open-ended games that allow players to create their own stories, and there's few titles that exemplify this philosophy more than Crusader Kings 3. Now at a glance, Crusader Kings 3 is your typical grand strategy game where players are tasked with building up their nation by subjugating all their neighbors through conquest and diplomacy. However, what separates it from other games in the genre is that Crusader Kings 3 is also a pretty fantastic role-playing experience, as well as a medieval dating simulator that allows you to whore your way throughout the Middle Ages. But for the purposes of this video, my sights would be set on seducing one person in particular, and if you're watching, then you already know that I'm talking about the Pope.
Now, I tell you what, I like you, and I want you.
So allow me to introduce Elisa Dustini, the Duchess of Tuscany. Compassionate, brave, zealous, and not to mention extremely easy on the eyes, Elisa was the ideal Catholic woman. Well, I mean, she does already have 2 daughters from fathers who have been lost to history, but that shouldn't be a deal breaker. And it wasn't for Pope Alexander, who proved to be very receptive to Elisa's advancements. In fact, things were progressing so well between the two of them, this was looking like it was going to be the easiest challenge of all time. So of course there was an outbreak of typhus at the Vatican, and Alexander ends up being one of the victims. Now, I'll admit, I was a little annoyed, but there's no point in crying over spilt milk or dead popes, so I quickly had Elisa move on and set her sights on Alexander's successor, Kalistus. However, this is when my plan hit a bit of a snag, as I soon realized that Kalistus was super gay. Now, normally, I wouldn't give a shit. I mean, if the Pope wants to be a giant hypocrite who secretly fantasizes about how hot and ripped Jesus looks on the cross, then that's his business. I'm more of a Mary Magdalene kind of guy myself, but you do you. But right now, the Pope's gay business was interfering with Elisa's ambitions, and we can't have that now, can we? The good news is that the typhus outbreak in Rome was still going strong, and Kalistus would soon find himself afflicted by it, so it was looking like this issue might solve itself. Unfortunately, though, he somehow made a miraculous recovery, so Elisa was forced to directly intervene. But I made sure she wasn't flying in blind. Elisa spent a few years honing her nefarious skills, then her and her spy master Marquissa began framing the Pope's associates for various indecencies, which she would then use to blackmail them into assisting her with her murderous scheme, while other, less scrupulous individuals had been able to be recruited with some good old-fashioned bribery. Eventually, everything comes to fruition, and Kalistus meets his end thanks to a deadly viper, allowing Elisa to evade all suspicion. Now, Kalistus is replaced with Benedictus, who was not gay, so I was hoping that Elisa might actually have a chance with him, but those dreams are short-lived, as I quickly learn that Benedictus is actually a godless craven, which means he has absolutely no interest in a bold and devout woman such as Elisa. Because, you know, that's how that would go down.
A Knight of the Brotherhood. We're not supposed to.
Okie dokie.
Ironically though, his ability to resist temptation would be what led to his downfall, as a pope who wasn't DTF wasn't of much use to Elisa, so she soon begins plotting against him. And as a bonus, most of Kalistus' staff was still employed by the Vatican, and they were still under Elisa's thumb, which significantly reduced the amount of legwork required in the lead-up. However, as I mentioned earlier, at heart, Elisa was a highly compassionate woman who took no pleasure in conspiring against her heads of faith. But while weaker individuals might have succumbed to alcohol or turn to cleanse their sins with a single lash during their low points, Elisa would instead work off her anxieties with exercise and became noted for her fitness regime. And there was the occasional international incident that offered a welcome diversion. And while Pope Benedictus might have claimed to have a direct line of communication with the Heavenly Father, in the end it still wouldn't be enough to save him from a bunch of pissed off peasants.
No, there's no justice like angry mob justice.
Eugenius III was the next pope on deck, and he would also prove to have a personality clash with Elisa. Now, I know you're probably thinking I quickly set about planning to have Elisa murder him, just like she'd done to the 2 popes who had preceded him, and I can see why I'd come to this conclusion, but rather than having this pope outright killed, I decided to have Elisa stage a kidnapping instead, and she was even able to convince Eugenius to unknowingly help fund the whole operation. It's also worth pointing out that throughout the years, Elisa had resisted numerous suitors who had attempted to win her heart, as she had no desire to wear the scarlet letter. However, one night during a feast, she found herself being propositioned by her spy master, and the 2 of them would enter into a steamy little lesbian liaison, which obviously only increased Marquissa's devotion to her duchess. Eventually, Pope Eugenius would find himself locked in Elisa's dungeon after being snatched up during a late-night prayer session. But my excitement quickly turns into mild disappointment moment when I discover I'm not able to recruit the Pope to my court and then force him into marriage. Which makes sense, you know, considering he has the whole Vatican to run and everything, so I guess I really hadn't thought this one through, so that's on me. Anyway, Elisa has no use for a pet Pope, and it seemed more trouble than was worth keeping him alive, so he was quickly disposed of. Eugenius III was replaced by Eugenius IV, but there wasn't much of a difference between the two, as he would also tell Elisa to hit the bricks. I'm sure you can guess by now, this ended up being a very poor decision. Now that we were 5 popes deep, I'll admit I was beginning to think that Elisa would never accomplish her goal. You know, not every man who loves basketball gets to play in the NBA, and not every woman with a devout love of Jesus gets to call the Pope daddy. That's just how it goes sometimes. But the game must have sensed I was discouraged and getting close to calling off the whole thing, because the newly elected Pope Anastasius was actually willing to give the Duchess of Tuscany a chance. Granted, it wasn't much of a chance, but by this point she was willing to take what she could get. While things started off promising between the two, Elisa's attempts at wooing the Pope would run into a few snags. Still, she never faltered or strayed from her course, and her devotion was rewarded when she saved Anastasius from a stag while out on a hunt, and the two proclaimed their everlasting love for one another. Sadly, by this point, Elisa was just past her childbearing years, which meant that my true goal of starting off a line from the Pope's bastard that would one day rise up and overthrow the papacy would have to wait until another video. Still, it turns out that hooking up with the head of the Catholic Church did have its perks, mainly the fact that Anastasius was now extremely nonchalant about granting Elisa claims on the lands of her various neighbors, which allowed her to rapidly expand her sphere of influence and transform Tuscany into the dominant political force on the Italian peninsula. So when Anastasius announced he was launching a campaign to reclaim Jerusalem, Elisa was more than happy to commit all of her forces to the cause, even though it predictably ended up being a complete and total disaster. Some of her newly acquired subjects would attempt to take advantage of the situation for their own benefit. On several occasions, Elisa even found herself on the brink of being forced to give in to their demands, but somehow she just always managed to scratch and claw her way to victory. Still, even though she was able to outwit and outlast all of her rivals, death comes for all of us in the end, and after ruling as the Duchess of Tuscany for 46 years, Elisa finally passed on to the afterlife and handed over the reins to her oldest daughter, Thomasina. Thomasina attempted to follow her beloved mother's example and wasted little time putting the moves on Anastasius, but those plans were short-lived when the old bastard croaked, and his successor quickly lets his opinion of the new Duchess of Tuscany be known to all when he begins granting other lords claims on her territory due to her lowly status as a woman. And that's not to mention that she'd already been forced to split her inheritance with her sister. So within only a few years of her death, almost everything Elisa had dedicated her life to build was already on the verge of falling apart. But for one brief and shining moment, she had one of the most powerful and influential men on the planet wrapped around her little finger. So I consider this to be a challenge successfully completed. Hey everybody, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you didn't, then I've got no clue why you're still hanging around at this point. Like, what the hell are you doing? But if you did enjoy it, then why not leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel so you can be kept up to date with all my latest content. Or don't, you know. Don't let me tell you how to live your life. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. I'm out.